Hello, class, and welcome to Historical Geology, Geology 1B. I'm Robert Lopez. I'm going to look here at the Environments and Deposition Lab, make a little short tutorial here on this lab. So the first part, this is from my video lectures on mostly sedimentary rocks, but it comes up over again when we're discussing the origin of history of sedimentary rocks. And remember, you're going from some source rock, and the four steps that involved is there is weathering, right? So weathering is that liberation of components, whether you're doing it chemically or physically, right? So those two types of weathering. And then there's erosion, and erosion is separated from weathering. Remember, erosion is the transportation, the movement. There's several agents, of transportation: glaciers, wind, rivers, gravity. All those are examples of agents of transportation. So erosion goes here, and then that sediment ends up in a basin, some depositional environment. So this would be deposition, and that's what this lab is about, depositional environment. Where is it? In the marine environment, in the transitional environment, like the shoreline, maybe a marshland, or is it somewhere on the continent in the terrestrial environment? And we'll talk about those here in this lab. So that's the environment deposition. And finally, the last step is that you got to convert the sediment, which is loose material, into a rock. And that's called lithification. So that would go here. And so review your notes on that process as well. Remember, there's 3 steps in the lithification. All right, so when we're looking at the different depositional environments, we have the terrestrial, which are the continental or non-marine. And you can see that we're going to separate them into fluvial, which deal with river systems, aeolian, which is wind, lacustrine is water in terms of lakes, kind of still, quiet water. So usually lacustrine deposits are fine grain, silts and clays. Think about the playa lake beds. And so you might even think about evaporites in there. Yeah, evaporites here, gypsum and halite there. And then glacial deposits are another one. The key thing about glacial deposits are the glacial deposits are very poorly sorted, and this word till refers to any rock or material that's plucked, carried, and dropped off by the glacier. And that till often has these scratches on them that tell you if they've been grinding against other rocks as they've been transferred by the glacier. And then palatal, this refers to kind of swampy environments, kind of maybe like a bayou. Think about, quiet waters, floodplains, beyond the floodplains, the backwater, the bayous, the swamp deposits, maybe a bog deposits. So they can be in a variety of different environments. And they're usually gray to black clays, which, they have some coal, which indicate that they're reducing environments. In other words, there's little oxygen because the water is so still and it's not really being turned very much, right? So it tends to lose oxygen. And actually, we get some fossilization. So we'll talk more about, I think one of our problems later on is going to deal with this kind of swampy palatal environment. So make sure you read through these. Maybe as I go through the lab, we're going to refer back to these different terrestrial environments, so some clues as to how we can define, less poorly sorted sediment, for alluvial fans, sandstones and conglomerates, right? So we'll come back to this here and we'll look more in more detail. Then the second environment is the transitional, and that's kind of the shorelines, the deltas, tidal flats, lagoons, right? So all those occur in here. Maybe we don't have them here on the west coast, but certainly on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, there are those big tide bars, or sandbars, like I'm thinking of like Galveston, Texas. It's basically on a big sandbar out there. So a little bit different environments. And then lagoons, usually between the land and those bars are lagoons. But lagoons also occur in islands and other areas like that. Tidal flats, beaches, deltas, right? So we'll come back to these as well. And then we'll come back, we'll look at this in a moment. But then the third environment is this marine environment. And the marine environment is, and I think I cover this in detail in my video lectures, but remember that, we're looking at both active margins and passive margins. And for the passive margin, this Atlantic type, We often call these a trailing continental margin because remember the Atlantic coast of the United States is not a tectonic boundary. It trails the activity at the mid-oceanic ridge in the mid-Atlantic or over here on the west coast, right? So that's why we call it a trailing margin, trailing continental margin. But they're passive. There's no active tectonic faults. In fact, the North American plate basically starts at the mid-Atlantic ridge, Atlantic Ocean, and goes all the way here to the west coast, right, to the San Andreas Fault or the Cascadia subduction zone up in the north. So that Atlantic coast is a passive margin, right? Sometimes we call it cratonic settings. So remember, the craton is the old stable interior of the continent. And so here we'll have the shelf break, the slope, and there's a term we use, we call it epipelagic. So epipelagic, remember pelagic means deep, means the water column. So the epi means on top. So this is the topmost layer of the water column. And usually that's 200 meters and shallower. And so that epipelagic region is the continental shelf, right? And so here, you can see that this continental shelf goes out to about the shelf break, which worldwide is about 200 meters deep. But on the passive margins, it could extend for a huge region, right? So they're very broad and wide continental shelves in these passive margins. And then you drop, you kind of go off the edge here, the drop off, and you go down the continental slope. It's a steeper inclination toward the deeper parts of the ocean. You may have reefs. Actually, usually the reefs occur more, not really at the edge of the continental shelf. They're probably closer to shore, closer to the shoreline. All right, but they're going to be on the shelf there, whether they're rocky reefs or coral reefs, depending on the latitude. And the continental rise would be where at the base of that slope, where all that sediment, apron of sediment collects there. And usually we call those abyssal fans or submarine fans. In fact, if we look at the picture up here, there it is, right? So this would be our shelf break here, 200 meters, right, worldwide, about that's the average depth. And then you do this drop off down the slope here. And then this whole region here is where sediment collects, an apron of sediment called the rise. So this transition from the slope to the abyssal plain would be the rise. And often at submarine canyons, we get these big abyssal fans. There's a huge one at the base of the Monterey Canyon here in California. All right, and so that's our passive margins. And the other margin is the active margin or Pacific type. And those they're called orogenic. Remember, oro means mountain and genesis for genic. So you're making mountains like the very young coast ranges and Cascade ranges, right? The young volcanoes and the Andes Mountains, all those are active margins, right? So there's tectonic activity, faulting, earthquakes, volcanoes, right? Now, so note that these are going to have very narrow continental shelves, 50 kilometers, maybe a little bit more, but usually around that or less in some cases. And again, we're getting to the shelf break at 200 meters because that's about worldwide where we see it. 140 to 200 is kind of the range, but we'll just go with 200 because remember, that's the base of the epipelagic zone for the oceans. And instead of a rise, we see an ocean trench. So instead of seeing a rise here, you would see a trough where the ocean plate would be subducting under the continent there. And those deep ocean trenches can get up to about 30,000 feet deep, especially the Mariana Trench. That's about 36,000 feet deep, deepest place on Earth. All right, but then beyond the trench, we do get the abyssal plain over there as well, right? So I think I draw some of those in my video lectures, so you should have those in your notes. And then when we're looking at the marine environment, we're looking at either shallow waters or the deeper marine waters. And it's a little confusing here because geologists have a little bit different terminology for the marine environments than oceanographers. So oceanographers call the pelagic zone the water column, and it could be anywhere from like 2 feet deep to 2 miles deep. That's all pelagic. It's just the water. And then geologists, when they say the word pelagic, they're usually meaning waters that are deeper than 200 meters. So these are waters that are beyond the shelf break, pelagic waters. So the real water column out in the deep ocean. And anything that's occurring in shallow waters, we still use the word oceanographers use, and that word is called neritic. So neritic would be the shallow waters, neritic waters, whereas pelagic. So when you hear the word pelagic sediment, we're talking about these deep marine siliceous oozes like the cherts, the turbidites. We may talk about the abyssal pelagic clays, right? So out there in the deep ocean. Whereas neritic sediment would be like these sands or silts or shales, maybe these carbonates here in shallow warm waters, right? Depends on the environment, right? So so keep in mind. So think of these as neritic and think of these as pelagic down here. All right, and then just kind of reviewing our picture here. So for the terrestrial settings, right, alluvial fans. Here we have the drying playa lakes, the dry lake beds, which is the lacustrine environment, lake bed. We can have, so an estuary would be more of a transitional environment. The deltas are transitional, beaches are transitional. Here we have the palado, the coastal swamps, right? Or note that they're occurring on the floodplains or the bayous of rivers as well, the bogs and swamps. All right, so as